Welcome back. In this second part, we're continuing our lesson on AWS responsibilities within the Shared Responsibility Model. In the previous video, we explored how AWS handles physical security and protects the global infrastructure that runs cloud services. Now, we're going to build on that foundation by looking at two more key areas of AWS responsibility: foundational service security and compliance and certification management. These areas are crucial because they give customers the confidence to run mission-critical workloads on AWS, knowing the underlying platform is secure, compliant, and continuously monitored. So let's break each one down. 1. Foundational service security. When you use AWS services, whether it's EC2 for compute, S3 for storage, RDS for databases, or VPC for networking, you're building your applications on top of a massive layer of AWS managed infrastructure. Foundational service security means that AWS ensures all of these base services are secure by design before a customer ever touches them. Think of it like renting an apartment. Before you move in, the building itself must be structurally sound. Electricity, plumbing, walls, fire alarms, they must all be working and safe. AWS provides that same guarantee, but at the infrastructure level. Here are some examples. Compute, EC2. AWS secures the physical servers, hypervisors, and virtualization layer that run customer instances. Storage, S3, EBS. AWS ensures data durability mechanisms, replication processes, and fault-tolerant storage systems are properly configured. Databases, RDS, DynamoDB. AWS manages the underlying hardware, patching, replication, and automatic failover mechanisms. Networking, VPC backbone. AWS protects routing, switching, DDoS mitigation systems, and the global network infrastructure. The key takeaway is this: customers are responsible for how they configure the service, but AWS is responsible for securing the service itself. This allows customers to innovate faster without worrying about infrastructure-level vulnerabilities. 2. Compliance and certification management. The second area is all about compliance. Companies across industries, finance, healthcare, government, e-commerce, must meet strict regulatory requirements. AWS helps customers achieve this by maintaining an enormous library of compliance certifications. AWS undergoes continuous third-party audits for frameworks like PCI DSS for credit card processing, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 for security, availability, and financial controls. ISO 27001, International Security Standard. HIPAA, Healthcare Data Protection. FedRAMP, U.S. Government Cloud Compliance. These certifications verify that AWS's infrastructure is secure, controlled, monitored, and documented according to global standards. What does this mean for customers? AWS provides something called shared compliance. AWS secures the infrastructure and proves it with official documentation. Customers, in turn, use that documentation to build compliant solutions on top of AWS, for example. A hospital using AWS to store medical records can rely on AWS's HIPAA-eligible services. A financial institution building payment systems relies on AWS's PCI DSS compliance. A government agency can deploy workloads on AWS GovCloud for FedRAMP-approved architecture. AWS handles the heavy lifting so you don't need your own auditors inspecting global data centers. All right, so at this point, go ahead and pause the video. Take a moment to read the question carefully. and try to answer it on your own. Once you've made your choice, resume the video. Next, I'll walk you through a few clues to help you identify the correct answer. Let's take a look at the next question. This one focuses on managed services in the AWS Shared Responsibility Model, specifically Amazon RDS for MySQL. The question asks, a customer is using Amazon RDS for MySQL. Who is responsible for patching the database engine software and the underlying operating system of the managed service? Before we jump into the answer, here are some clues to help you think through it. Clue 1. Managed services shift responsibilities. When you use a managed service like RDS, AWS takes over many of the operational tasks that customers normally handle on EC2, especially tasks related to infrastructure and maintenance. Clue 2. Think about what managed database means. Ask yourself, does the customer install MySQL? Does the customer manage the OS behind RDS? Or does AWS handle all of that so customers only manage data, backups, users, and configurations? Clue 3. RDS is designed to remove heavy admin work. RDS exists to remove undifferentiated heavy lifting, especially things like database engine patching, OS patching, hardware maintenance. So think, who would normally do this work on EC2 versus who does it on RDS? Now let's reveal the correct answer to this question. The correct answer is AWS patches the database engine and underlying OS for RDS. Let's break down why this is correct and why the other options don't fit. Why this is the correct answer. Amazon RDS is a fully managed database service. This means AWS takes responsibility for all the heavy operational tasks that customers would normally have to manage on their own, including patching the database engine like MySQL, updating the underlying operating system, handling backups, failover, and hardware maintenance. All of this falls under security of the cloud, which is AWS's side of the shared responsibility model when you use a managed service. Customers only manage things inside the database, like users, schema, data, and optional settings. Why the other choices are incorrect. 1. The customer must fully patch the MySQL engine manually. Incorrect. In RDS, customers do not install or patch the DB engine themselves. AWS manages this for you. 2. Patch responsibility depends on the RDS instance size. Incorrect. Patch responsibility does not change based on instance size. A small instance and a large instance get the same managed patching behavior from AWS. 3. The customer patches the OS and AWS patches the database engine. Incorrect. Customers never access or patch the underlying OS for RDS. Both the OS and the DB engine fall under AWS responsibility in managed services. Because Amazon RDS is a managed service, AWS handles patching of both the database engine and the underlying OS. Customers only manage database-level settings, permissions, and data, not the infrastructure. Now that we've covered what the customer is responsible for and what AWS is responsible for, let's look at something equally important: the responsibilities that both AWS and the customer share. This is where the shared responsibility model becomes very practical, because some security tasks require both sides to work together to keep environments safe. In this first shared category, we're talking about security configuration and management. Here's how this works. AWS provides the secure building blocks. That means AWS takes care of things like offering secure services with strong default protections, providing encryption capabilities, giving us firewall tools such as security groups and network ACLs, maintaining the underlying IAM framework. So AWS gives us the tools and ensures they are secure at the infrastructure level. But the customer decides how those tools are configured. That includes responsibilities like choosing and enforcing encryption settings, writing port rules for security groups, assigning IAM permissions and policies, managing how exposed or accessible your resources are. So think of this as AWS giving you a strong, secure foundation, and then you make decisions on top of it that determine how tight or loose your security posture will be. For example, AWS gives you the ability to encrypt S3 buckets, but you choose whether encryption is enabled. AWS provides IAM, but you decide who gets admin access. AWS offers security groups, but you write the inbound and outbound rules. This is why misconfigurations, like leaving an S3 bucket public, fall under customer responsibility, even though AWS is providing secure infrastructure. So in summary, AWS provides secure tools. The customer configures them properly, and together, these shared responsibilities create a secure cloud environment. All right, let's move on to another really important area where AWS and the customer share responsibility: patch management. This is one of the most commonly tested and misunderstood parts of the shared responsibility model, because the correct answer depends entirely on the AWS service you're using. Let me break it down in a very simple way. 1. AWS responsibility: patching the infrastructure. AWS is always responsible for patching anything below the virtualization layer. That includes physical servers in the data centers, the hypervisor, the underlying platform software that your instances run on. In other words, AWS ensures the foundation is secure and up to date, so you never have to worry about hardware-level vulnerabilities. 2. Customer responsibility: patching EC2, guest OS, and applications. But when you choose a service like Amazon EC2, AWS gives you the virtual machine, and you are responsible for everything inside it. That includes patching the guest operating system, Linux, Windows, etc., updating application software, applying security patches to frameworks, runtime environments, and your code. If there's a vulnerability in your Ubuntu OS, your EASE server, your Python runtime, or your Node.js app, you must patch it. AWS will not touch anything inside your EC2 instance. 3. Shared aspect: managed services like Amazon RDS. Now here's where the shared responsibility becomes very clear. When you use managed services, such as Amazon RDS, Amazon DynamoDB, or Amazon Elasticache, AWS takes on more responsibility. For example, in Amazon RDS, AWS patches the database engine itself, MySQL, PostgreSQL, SQL Server, etc. AWS also patches the underlying OS. But you choose when those patches are applied by setting maintenance windows. So AWS handles the technical heavy lifting, but you control the timing to avoid disruptions to your workload. A simple way to remember it: if you manage the OS, you patch it. If AWS manages the OS, AWS patches it. If AWS manages the engine, like RDS, AWS updates it, you choose the maintenance window. Why this matters? Understanding patch management is crucial because patching failures are one of the biggest causes of security breaches. AWS gives you secure infrastructure, but the way you manage and update your software determines your security posture. Compliance and audit. Compliance is not something that AWS handles entirely, nor is it something the customer is left to manage alone. Instead, it's a partnership. Each side has its own responsibilities that work together to create a compliant environment. Let's break down what each side handles. 1. What AWS provides. AWS is responsible for maintaining compliance for the cloud itself, that is, the global infrastructure, data centers, and the underlying services you build on top of. AWS secures and certifies all of this through well-known frameworks such as SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3, PCI DSS for handling payment card data, HIPAA for healthcare workloads, ISO 27001, International Security Standard, FedRAMP for U.S. government systems. AWS undergoes rigorous third-party audits and publishes the results in AWS Artifact, a service that gives customers ready access to compliance reports and security documentation. So AWS is essentially saying, here is proof that our foundation is secure and compliant. This is a huge operational benefit. You don't need to certify data centers or maintain compliance for physical infrastructure. AWS does all of that for you. 2. What the customer is responsible for. While AWS provides the certifications, you are responsible for using the cloud in a compliant way. This means configuring your workloads securely, protecting your data, setting proper access controls, managing encryption, ensuring your applications follow compliance rules, keeping records and evidence for your own audits. You can think of this like renting a certified, secure building. The building is compliant, but how you use your office must also meet standards. For example, if you store credit card data in S3, AWS provides PCI certification for the storage platform, but you must configure the bucket policies, encryption, IAM permissions, and logging in a PCI-compliant way. For HIPAA workloads, AWS provides the HIPAA-eligible services, but you must secure the PHI, manage access, and configure auditing. In short, AWS gives you the compliant tools. You must use them correctly. Why this is a shared responsibility. Compliance doesn't stop at the infrastructure layer. Auditors must review AWS's controls handled by AWS, the customer's controls handled by you. How both sets of controls work together. AWS provides the evidence, but customers provide the implementation. Simple memory trick. AWS proves compliance of the cloud. You prove compliance in the cloud. If you remember this distinction, you'll answer almost any exam question on cloud compliance correctly. Now let's move into the final shared responsibility area for this section: continuous monitoring. This is an incredibly important concept because keeping your environment secure isn't something you do once. It's an ongoing effort shared between AWS and the customer. Continuous monitoring ensures that both AWS and the customer maintain visibility into what's happening across their environments and can quickly detect operational issues, misconfigurations, or security threats. Let's break down what each side handles. 1. What AWS monitors. AWS is responsible for monitoring the cloud infrastructure itself, everything that customers don't have direct access to. This includes data centers and physical hardware, global network and backbone connections, hypervisors and underlying services, threats or anomalies in AWS managed layers. For example, if there's suspicious activity at a data center, a hardware failure, or a network disruption, AWS detects and responds to it. Customers don't need to install sensors, manage surveillance, or run diagnostics on AWS infrastructure. That's all handled by AWS. This ensures the environment you're building on stays healthy, secure, and available. 2. What the customer monitors. Customers are responsible for monitoring everything they build and configure inside AWS. This includes application logs, for example, errors, performance issues, user behavior, API activity. Monitored through AWS Cloud, Trail. Changes in resource configuration, using AWS config to detect drift or misconfigurations. Security threats at the workload level, using services like Amazon Guard, Duty. For example, if an IAM user starts making unusual API calls, Guard Duty warns you. If an S3 bucket suddenly becomes public, AWS config flags it. If your EC2 instance's CPU spikes, CloudWatch alerts you. AWS provides the tools, but the responsibility to enable, configure, and act on alerts belongs to the customer. Why continuous monitoring is shared? Neither AWS nor the customer can secure the environment alone. AWS ensures the foundation is monitored. The customer ensures their applications and configurations are monitored. Together, they maintain end-to-end visibility and security. You can think of it like an apartment building. AWS monitors the building structure, elevators, power systems, and entry doors. You monitor what happens inside your apartment: locks, appliances, smoke alarms, and who you allow inside. Both must work together for full safety. Simple exam reminder. AWS monitors the infrastructure. You monitor everything running on the infrastructure. If you remember that distinction, you'll answer continuous monitoring questions correctly every time.
All right, so at this point, go ahead and pause the video. Take a moment to read the question carefully and try to answer it on your own. Once you've made your choice, resume the video. Next, I'll walk you through a few clues to help you identify the correct answer.
All right, let's take a look at the next practice question. This one focuses on encryption responsibilities in AWS, a classic area where the shared responsibility model shows up. Let's read it together. A business stores sensitive data in Amazon S3. AWS provides encryption mechanisms, KMS SSC S3, but the customer must enable encryption and manage access policies. What does this scenario illustrate? Now let's think through a few clues to guide you toward the right answer. Clue 1. AWS offers encryption tools, but AWS does not decide when or how you use them. If you want encryption in S3, you as the customer must turn it on or configure it. Clue 2. AWS is responsible for the encryption mechanisms themselves, like KMS infrastructure, key durability, and the security of the hardware behind encryption. But the customer is responsible for making choices. Should this bucket be encrypted? Who can access these keys? What policies should apply? Clue 3. If the scenario shows that AWS provides the tools and the customer configures them, you're likely looking at a shared responsibility situation, not full AWS responsibility and not full customer responsibility. Clue 4. Remember, encryption capability equals AWS responsibility. Encryption configuration and enforcement equals customer responsibility. Use these clues to identify the best answer. Then in the next slide, we'll reveal the correct option and break down why it's correct. The correct answer is, encryption is a shared responsibility where AWS provides tools and customers configure them properly. AWS gives you the encryption mechanisms like KMS, SSEs3, and the secure infrastructure behind them. But AWS does not turn encryption on for you or decide who can access your data. That part is your responsibility. You enable encryption on the S3 bucket. You create and manage access policies. You decide who can use or manage the keys. So this scenario perfectly illustrates the shared responsibility model. AWS provides the secure tools. The customer must configure and use them correctly.
Thank you for watching. See you in the next class.